the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, August 5th, 2015. Africa analyst Emira Woods joins us to discuss the new Ebola vaccine, the hoopla over Cecil the Lion, and Obama's recent tour of the continent. And in the wake of the latest Planned Parenthood controversy, we'll speak with Aspen Baker about her book, Pro-Voice, How to Keep Listening When the World Wants a Fight. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
President Obama has just launched a campaign to win over members of the U.S. Congress to approve of a deal with Iran that his administration worked hard to broker. Obama plans to lay out his arguments in a speech at American University in Washington, D.C. today. The deal, if passed by Congress, would lift some sanctions on Iran in exchange for assurances that Iran would not develop a nuclear weapon for several years. Opposition to the deal comes primarily from the Israeli lobby group AIPAC, which, echoing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, hopes to convince the U.S. Congress that the deal is bad for Israel. Already 3 Democratic senators, including California's Barbara Boxer, have announced their support for the deal. Obama hopes the Iran deal will be a prominent feature of his foreign policy legacy. The deadline to vote on it is September 17th. Well, Courtney, if the GOP votes down this deal, won't it be like cutting off your nose to spite your face? Do you think that they despise Obama so much that they're willing to risk international embarrassment for the U.S.?
Well, I think that these days it seems like there's definitely Republicans seem to be operating under the logic of I will destroy this village in order to save it. And I think that, what we're really seeing here is the degree to which the Israel lobby led by AIPAC has really shaped the political response to this nuclear agreement by painting it as a deal that threatens the national security of Israel by essentially giving Iran the resources to develop nuclear weapons capacity. And I think that, again, this is a historic deal that is necessary. It will essentially remap our political relationships in the Middle East by allowing us to engage with Iran as a political partner rather than an adversary. And this will go a long way to change the public perception of the United States in the region, as well as avoiding further military conflict in the region, particularly with Iran, while also giving the international community the ability to monitor nuclear development in the country. So this is a critical agreement and it needs to happen. But I think the question really remains whether Republicans will support a diplomatic turn in the region or if they're going to continue to pursue the kinds of hawkish policy positions that the state of Israel seems to support these days.
And a new survey of policing in the United States comes just before the 1-year anniversary of the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. It's found that, quote, Black Americans are nearly 4 times as likely as whites to describe violence against civilians by police officers as an extremely or very serious problem. The survey also found that more than 80% of blacks say police are too quick to use deadly force, and they're more likely to use it against a black person. But contrary to that statistic, 2/3 of whites label police use of deadly force as necessary, and nearly 6 in 10 say race is not a factor in decisions to use force. The survey was conducted by the Associated Press and the Nork Center for Public Affairs Research. Both blacks and whites support changes to policing procedures. Well, Courtney, many surveys have found in the past that whites and blacks have very different perspectives on policing, but given all the evidence and the videos of racist policing in just the past year, are you surprised that whites are not more skeptical of police today?
I can't say that I'm surprised. I mean, I think polls have historically tended to show that blacks and whites, for the most part, tend to have sharply divergent views on the ways and the reasons why race matters in social life in the United States. And I think that while there are a growing number of white people who have come to see racially motivated police abuse as a serious structural problem, I think part of the issue is that black and brown communities really remain criminalized in the public imagination, so that when whites see videos or documentation of black and brown people having violent encounters with the police, the assumption is that they are engaging in criminal behavior that somehow prompted this militarized response to their behavior, right? And so I think that, again, what we see and what the study is revealing is that whites tend not to believe that these are serious issues, and that when people of color call out their experiences of racial abuse at the hands of the police, the assumption is that they're crying racism when really the issue is crime. And I think that there remains a tacit refusal to believe what black people say, which is why videos are necessary in the first place.
And finally, the Washington Post is reporting that the FBI has been digging into the security of Hillary Clinton's emails during her stint as Secretary of State. Secretary Clinton had used her own private email servers and hired a private Denver-based company called Platte River Networks to manage her system, which is the company that the FBI is now looking into. According to the Post, quote, the inquiries are bringing to light new information about Clinton's use of the system and the lengths to which she went to install a private channel of communication outside government control, a setup that has emerged as a major issue in her campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, end of quote. So far, Clinton herself has not been singled out for any wrongdoing. Last December, she turned over tens of thousands of pages of work-related emails to the State Department and said that she deleted her personal email sent from the same account. Well, Courtney, some days ago, journalist Trevor Timm, writing for The Guardian, said, quote, sorry, Hillary Clinton fans, her email errors are definitely newsworthy. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think Hillary Clinton's emails are definitely newsworthy. And if you care about issues of government transparency and, state accountability, and you're also concerned about these larger discussions around mass surveillance, absolutely Hillary Clinton's emails are worth talking about. It's frankly impossible to believe that she somehow thought that using her private email exclusively to conduct governmental business was her following the letter and spirit of the law. I just don't see how anyone could buy that argument. And it's disturbing because essentially by doing that, she created a back door to make it difficult, if not impossible, for people to be able to file Freedom of Information Act requests on those emails, to monitor what she was doing during those time, and really to have a sense of what information she was using that she had access to as she was using that private email account. So absolutely, I agree with his argument, and I think that most people will agree that this is something that they need to be paying attention to, and she's going to have to answer for this as she's running for the presidency.
Courtney, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The Lancet Medical Journal last week published what many people have been waiting for years to hear, that an initial clinical trial for a potential Ebola vaccine was showing amazing success. The vaccine, which goes by the name RVSV-ZEBOV, was rushed through 3 phases of trials within a year, which is remarkably speedy. It showed a 100% efficacy rate. However, because levels of infection of the deadly virus were already tailing off, those statistics may change. For many months last year, all we heard coming out of Africa was news of the Ebola crisis. And in the past week or so, all we've heard about is the trophy hunting of the Zimbabwean lion Cecil and the American dentist who paid $55,000 for the privilege of shooting him with a gun. But often, getting far less media coverage than it deserves is the U.S.'s Africa policy. With President Obama recently taking a historic tour of African nations, we turn today to my guest, Emira Woods, to examine U.S. AFRICOM, President Obama's historic speech in Addis Ababa, and more. Emira Woods is the Director of Social Impact at ThoughtWorks. Welcome to Uprising, Emira.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, first, given the news of the Ebola vaccine, how seriously does the disease itself continue to threaten people's lives, particularly in the 3 hardest hit nations, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea?
Well, Sonali, thanks for raising this question. About a year ago, it was almost all Ebola that we were discussing. And, since then, the disease has taken over 11,000 lives. But I think the critical issue is that a year after all of that attention, what you still have in those 3 countries in particular, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, is a real lack of attention to what's ultimately going to not only address Ebola, but other which is strengthening health systems. You have health systems that are still in deplorable conditions, where the facilities are just not in place to have the type of isolation that's needed when facing a contagion like Ebola. So I think it is fundamentally addressing that need of strengthened health systems. It is addressing the need of healthcare workers. Remember, in each of those three countries, over the last year and a half, you have had nurses and other health practitioners going on strike because of poor wages, because of poor working conditions. So unless you are able to really address the structural issues of strengthening those health systems, strengthening the condition of health workers, many of whom saw their colleagues die in the past year. So unless those fundamentals are addressed, you will continue to have people very much put at risk, either from Ebola or from other diseases to come.
So, Emira, are you suggesting that those issues have not been really tackled? And if so, to what do you attribute the falling rates of infection? Clearly, something must have changed to slow down the rates of infection.
Well, I think what you had is a fundamental shift in people's behavior. There were, it took time, but civil society groups throughout the region came to the forefront and led the way in terms of awareness raising and best practices for actually stemming the flood of this disease in communities. You also had technicians, you had people who were techies building systems. For example, in Sierra Leone, you had the first ever what is here called 911, but a 711 system developed by Sierra Leoneans who recognized the need for an emergency call system. So it was a response to Ebola that remains in place today because people at the forefront of the crisis weren't just sitting with their sort of hands out, waiting to be saved, but were using their skills and tools and techniques to be able to put in place responses that would be long lasting. So I think all of this, in addition to some very direct action in terms of the vaccine, should be credited for having stemmed the tide, but you still have within each country at least one case that is active, and it's estimated 2,000 people now are still being monitored for exposure to the disease. So we will continue to feel the threat of the disease until those fundamental issues of how do you put resources into strengthening health systems, resources that are, for example, now going to repay debts at the World Bank or the IMF, that should be going towards building hospital facilities, building laboratory facilities, building community health workers, and strengthening the role of those health practitioners, both in rural and urban areas throughout the region. I think it is those fundamentals that are needed for the long term to actually address the crises and prevent future crises.
How important is the vaccine, however, that has been developed? The trial I mentioned was extremely speedy, and it was given the urgency, given the high numbers of infections and also the extremely high fatality rate among those infected. There was a very strong impetus to try to do these clinical trials as fast as possible. What do you make of this vaccine? Could it be the thing that finally helps to stem, at least in the short term, specifically Ebola, even if it doesn't address the broader issues of public health?
Well, I think, many have to be commended for the responses in terms of the vaccine, for decisions being made to give the vaccine, even in its trial period, to be able to kind of, again, to save lives. I think those decisions were made speedily, and the medical ethicists are still discussing whether or not even the tests of the vaccines are credible because of the fact that there was no sample group, for example, in these trials. So they were done in a way that was unorthodox, but I think many have seen the impact in a very direct way. So, I think more efforts are needed when it comes to vaccines, but it's not going to be the vaccines that will address these root causes of the problem. It will be strengthening health systems, making sure that there are facilities that people are able to access affordable healthcare. We talk about it in the U.S., the importance of affordable healthcare for all. Health is a right that should be accessed by all on this planet. And yet far too many, really, you said in the words of Occupy, the 99%, right? But far too many people on the planet, not only in West Africa, but around the planet, don't have access to that basic right to health.
And vaccine can't just be a substitute for that, certainly.
Exactly.
Now let's turn to the hue and cry over the Zimbabwean lion Cecil, who has become posthumously someone on a first name basis that people refer to on a first name basis here in the U.S. Why, first of all, do you think that the news of this lion being killed by an American dentist who hunts for sport, why has it generated so much media coverage?
Well, Sonali, that is an incredibly good question. And I have to say, I'm very much an animal lover, and
Sure, so am I.
that Africa, is kind of blessed with these pristine natural environments and natural habitats, but it just seems like the hysteria is stemming from a different source. It's almost as if, it's the legacy. Many of us think of it as like sort of the Tarzan legacy, right? Where Africa is equated with animals, and people are somehow rendered invisible. And so, I think is fundamentally addressing these questions. Why is it that the U.S. Congress was able to move so speedily on an issue concerning a lion, and yet the same resolve is not evident when it comes to issues of worker rights on the continent and elsewhere in the world, when it comes to issues of actually dealing with climate change or some of these fundamental challenges of the continent. It seems as if the resolve is not there. So I think we've got to really examine to what extent the media intensity and the fury over this lion, to what lessons are there for us to learn in terms of how people are viewing Africa, both now and historically, how people are viewing the contributions of and the presence of African peoples and their gifts to the world, now and historically, in this frame that is still very much Africa as a safari land. And so I think we've got to challenge the frame. I think we've got to raise the visibility of the contributions of African peoples, not only those on the continent, but those throughout the diaspora, and really force the issue as you're doing now. So I applaud you for raising the question. And I think we've got to have more people probing and trying to really expand the lens on this critical moment in history.
And Emira, you referred to the U.S. Congress, which very swiftly drafted the Conserving Ecosystems by Ceasing the Importation of Large Animal Trophies Act, or the Cecil Act. And people pointed out two sort of hypocrisies immediately. The life of Cecil the Lion was seen as more important than the life of African Americans here in the United States. So many unarmed African Americans killed by police, and Congress has done nothing. But also compared to, as you pointed out, the fact that even Zimbabweans on the ground, actual human beings on the ground, are ignored. There's a lot, Zimbabwe is in crisis with longtime dictator Robert Mugabe continuing to basically dictate policies in the country. More than 72% of Zimbabweans live below the poverty line. And Zimbabwean journalists pointed out the U.S. hypocrisy by saying almost no one's heard of the journalist and activist named Itai Zamara, who was kidnapped 4 months ago, remains missing. He was central to the Occupy Africa Unity Square campaign against Mugabe. Americans have heard of Cecil the Lion, but most have never heard of Itai Zamara. Is that because of how terrible U.S. media coverage is, or simply the priorities of the U.S. public?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two, right? It is both the media and the narrow lens, the sort of, what's hot at the moment, and everyone jumping on that bandwagon hysteria, right? But I think in a fundamental way, there's a disregard for Black lives. And so, again, it's both on the continent and in the diaspora. Black lives matter. It's a powerful mantra, because we see so systematically across this planet where Black lives are being devalued, are rendered invisible, and so I think it is critical for us to hold accountable a Congress that allows the figure of one Black life every 28 hours is now outdated, unfortunately, because we recognize that it's far more frequent that Black lives are being being lost, being men, women being killed in such dramatic fashion, because they are seen as the other, because they are seen as less critical, less visible. And so I think we've got to challenge that in a fundamental way. We've got to begin to kind of raise linkages and the importance of Black Lives Matter here in the U.S., Black Lives Matter in Zimbabwe and around the world, and it's really insulting for for a Twitter campaign to be talking about Lion Lives Matter. No, I think it's absolutely it's remarkable that people would even advance such a parallel. It is, in a fundamental way, an opportunity now for us to underscore that Black Lives Matter all across this planet, and it should not be the life of a lion that is held up in such regard when people are being snuffed out.
If only it were the case that life of a lion was the most important thing in Zimbabwe. Certainly it isn't. But let's turn to U.S. policies in Africa. In July, President Obama toured various African nations, among them Kenya, the home country of his father. It was the first time he had visited Kenya as president. He went to Addis Ababa and Ethiopia and then gave a major address to a number of African heads of state. How important was this address? It was a wide-ranging address. He talked about many things. He talked about democracy, but then he also talked about corruption, and he quite, I think, directly challenged African heads of state.
Well, so, the Obama trip, many say it was historic. It's the 5th time that Obama went to Africa. It's the first time that a U.S. sitting president addressed the African Union, but we see time and time again that with President Obama, there's a whole lot of symbolism. Really, once we go beyond the photo op, it's more of the same. It's the status quo, right? So, what I think President Obama failed to understand as he made that speech there at the African Union is that the U.S. has been complicit in holding up tyrants. Let's remember, historically, one of the best examples, Patrice Lumumba, a liberation leader from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was assassinated. Complicit in that was the CIA, the US and the UK, complicit in his assassination. Put in place was Mobutu, and kept in place for 30 years was, Mobutu in the DR Congo. Why? Because Mobutu allowed the access to resources, those vital resources that are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that the U.S. was interested in and the West was interested in. So it is duplicitous, I think, to make a speech at the African Union without recognizing that the role the U.S. has played in undermining democracy, in undermining the rule of law and citizens' ability to freely choose their leaders and hold those leaders accountable. But we can't just look historically. Just the past week we see the U.S. in Egypt, ignoring the human rights violations in Egypt and essentially giving military assistance to prop up what is very much an illegitimate government in Egypt. And you see time and time again, the U.S., because of its narrowly defined interests, often economic interests in the region, looks the other way and is complicit in propping up tyrants and ignoring their records on human rights and actually propelling them into office, giving the military support, whether it's the weapons, it's the military training, it's the in the intelligence operatives needed to bolster and to support their rule. So I think we've got to examine the role of the U.S. and U.S. policy in perpetuating undemocratic practices on the continent, and that was completely ignored in this lofty speech from President Obama.
Now, a prominent journalist named Andrew Mwenda responded to Obama's speech by writing an op-ed in Al Jazeera where he essentially said that Obama made, quote, ill-informed and stereotypical admonitions of our leaders, which attracted cheers from a large section of our elite class. Essentially, he said to Obama, mind your own business. Do you agree?
Well, I worry that the problem with the U.S. is that they see, Africa's resources as their business, and that's
right.
the problem. fundamentally, it's U.S. interests and Africa's resources. And let's remember, Obama was on this lofty trip about trade and investment. Trade and investment has been happening with Africa for 500 years. The problem is that it's been unequal. It's been destructive of the environment. It's been destructive of communities and harmful to workers. So the trade is not anything new. The problem is what is needed is a shift away from this, particularly the extractive resources as such a linchpin in the trade. I think so mind your own business. Yeah, I can see that, right? But I think we've got to also say that we need a reset button in terms of how the U.S. engages with Africa. And President Obama was able to some extent do that when it came to Cuba. There's a flag now flying here in Washington D.C.
Right.
It hasn't flown for 50 years, but when it comes to Africa, it's more of the same. It's let's extract as many resources as possible, and let's build up militaries to allow that extraction to happen, and let's continue business as usual, so that the very top, those that have, whether it's local elites or the multinational corporations, let them continue to generate greed in this fashion, to generate wealth and profits in such an extreme way. Let the status quo remain. And I think fundamentally that's the problem in terms of how the U.S. has engaged with the continent, and what is really a lost opportunity. 6 years ago, there was so much excitement that a son of Africa in the White House would be able to bring forward, new possibilities in terms of how the U.S. engages. And now, 6 years later, I think much of that excitement has gone away, has been replaced by a real recognition that it has been more of the same.
And in fact, U.S. policy in Africa is roughly encompassed by two initiatives. On the economic front, you have the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which Obama referred to in a speech. He just renewed that act for 10 years by signing it. And on the military front, you have AFRICOM, which is the United States African Command. Between these two, we see sort of the U.S.'s Africa policies, militarily and economically. But how are those, very broad-based speaking in the last couple of minutes of our conversation, do you feel that we need sort of a fundamental revisiting of these two initiatives?
Without a doubt. And when it comes to AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, many of us say it was misnamed because it actually brought growth and opportunity to the U.S.
Yeah.
It's still fundamentally, it's ironic when you see all of the opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, including members of Congress, standing up, vocally opposed to TPP because it undermines jobs, it creates inequality. And then when it comes to AGOA, which is fundamentally the same sort of free trade agenda, NAFTA for Africa, if you can think of it in that way, it is pushed through Congress without the criticism that was brought to the tables around TPP. So I think there is a lack of awareness or understanding of how these trade agreements are undermining democracy, are undermining people's ability to put food on the table, sovereignty, all of the rest. I think again, hitting that reset button would have been an opportune time under the Obama administration. It has not happened. It's been a continuation. So in fact, in terms of U.S. trade, 90% of U.S. trade with Africa is oil, is liquefied natural gas, it's mining, it's uranium, and all of these extractive industries that have been the source of U.S. interest for far too long. So I think fundamentally, trade agreements, there is a need to examine how the U.S. engages. That examination took place around the Trans-Pacific Partnership to some extent in terms of the U.S. public debating it. But when it comes to Africa, those debates were not there. But what was there was an increase in terms of U.S. military support, military engagement with the continent, an increase in both U.S. military sales and hardware, training, drones, intelligence, private military contractors running amok throughout the continent. Those are on a steady increase, and opportunities for people on the continent to actually have in this 21st century lives of dignity. When we see growing inequality, growing poverty, when we see lack of opportunity to choose leaders freely, all of these issues remain at play.
Well,
stage in the Obama
I
administration.
want to thank you so much, Emira, as always, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Emira Woods is the Director of Social Impact at ThoughtWorks. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The dubiously named group Center for Medical Progress has released a number of videos of conversations with staffers at Planned Parenthood that was surreptitiously filmed to drive the ongoing debate over abortion. Claiming that Planned Parenthood engages in the sale of fetal tissue for medical research, the group has enabled conservative politicians to plan a showdown over federal funding that covers non-abortion related health services. A fifth video was just released today. On Monday, the U.S. Senate defeated a bill that would have defunded Planned Parenthood, mostly because Democrats stood firm. But more battles lie ahead, and some fear a government shutdown over the funding. But to most ordinary Americans, feelings about abortion do not easily fit within the political dichotomy that the debate has created. Rather than claiming to be pro-choice or pro-life, my guest, Aspen Baker, explores what it means to be pro-voice. Aspen Baker is the founder and executive director of Exhale. She's the author of the book Pro-Voice, How to Keep Listening When the World Wants a Fight. Welcome to Uprising, Aspen.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonali.
Now, we've had an in-depth discussion on these latest series of attacks on Planned Parenthood and these videos and what they mean and what the agenda might be of this group. But on this interview, I'm excited actually to not get into those details and to talk instead about the gap between what politicians discuss versus what Americans actually go through. First, from your perspective, how skewed is the debate in the media and in Washington, D.C. compared to real life when we talk about abortion?
As you say, there's a really large gap between the way people actually experience abortion in their own lives and then what we hear about when we clue in and get into the politics around abortion. And my background is that I had an abortion when I got out of college about 15 years ago. And I was looking for emotional support. And when I went looking for it, all I found were services available on the pro-life side. And they were all Christian-based, and they were all about seeking forgiveness from God. And when I turned to the pro-choice side, there was nothing available. And so
because you'd already had an abortion, so at that point their job was over.
That is certainly what was implied and often said actually out loud as well, you know, that we helped you get it. It was legal, it was safe. So now it's up, you know, join us in the fight. And that's what we really need from you right now. And I thought it was strange that after all of these years of legal abortion, and how common it is that 1 in 3 women in America will have one in their lifetime, that there was so little personal conversation about abortion as an experience, as something that we went through. So the first thing that I did with my co-founders of my organization, Exhale, was create a talk line, free of judgment and free of politics and initially free of labels. We just wanted to create a place that was safe and confidential, and what hearing people say about their own abortions was so different from what was getting discussed politically around abortion.
And so, given that we don't get to hear much about or hear stories of women and what they go through, is there any sort of typical pattern that you see? Since obviously you've now heard many women and talked to thousands of women and their abortion experiences, are there certain kinds of women who get abortions versus those who don't? One might imagine that a woman who identifies as feminist might be more likely to get an abortion versus somebody who identifies as Catholic might be less likely. Do those stereotypes even hold?
They don't hold up very well, actually. And so one thing to know about our service is that we actually talk to women and men. So we're available to people who've had abortions and their loved ones. And some of the statistics that we know about people who have abortions and the people who call our talk line is that it's really common. So 1 in 3 women will have one in their lifetime. The majority of people who are having abortions are already mothers. We also know that Catholics are some of the most likely people to have an abortion. And so people come from all walks of life and have a variety of reasons and decision making. And yet what's so important for people to know is that each person's experience is unique. So there's not some single sort of universal experience, like all Catholics experience abortion in this way or all feminists experience abortion in this way. And if there's anything that is common across the board for the reasons that people call our talk line, it's because they're wondering if what they're feeling and experiencing is normal. Because really the only thing we hear about is the political debate. It's hard to understand sort of where your own personal experience sort of fits in amongst the spectrum of all of these other experiences. So even, someone who's calling, it's like, I feel sad, I'm not sure I did the right thing. And someone else who's calling saying, this was the best choice I've made in my life, I feel so much more confident about my future. Both of those people will call and say, am what I'm feeling normal? Do other people feel this way? And again, that's just a symbol of this gap that exists between the way that we talk about abortion in our own lives and the way that we need to versus the talking points and the sort of political arguments that we hear in public.
Has there been a reluctance from the pro-choice camp to hear about the fact that sometimes women do regret their abortions? I mean, we should just say that I'm vehemently pro-choice, but I can imagine that any decision a woman takes in her life about anything, there's always a possibility you might regret the decision.
I'm so glad that you brought up the question of regret. It's something we definitely hear about on our talk line. It is certainly, it feels like a political issue for many people. I am aware of that. And so your question of like if there has been resistance from the pro-choice side at any point, there certainly has been, and mostly in the beginning of when we've started, and the pro-choice movement and many activists have come a long way, and there's so much better emotional care and emotional support that's now offered to women who've had abortions. But regret does seem to be the one really difficult place for people to acknowledge and to validate. And it's something that we think that we need to talk about. And one of the reasons is that we think the message that women who have feelings of regret need to hear is that healing is possible, that well-being is possible, that other people have had feelings of regret, that they have been able to move through that and come to another place in their life. And it doesn't mean necessarily that those feelings go away, but it is something that they can live with and have a great life with afterwards. And instead, I think what happens a lot is there's a lot of like regret doesn't exist, or it's made up by the pro-life side, or women who feel like it was a good decision often talk about not feeling regret. So there's sort of like a regret or not regret dichotomy that continues to happen in the same way that there's this other dichotomy that exists around abortion. And so we just want to hear from women who have feelings of regret, and we want to give them that message that healing is possible.
And of course, real life is messy, right?
Real life is messy.
And that's the issue. Women might start out having regrets and then reconcile, etc. Let's talk about how the pro-life movement has tackled the issue of women's sort of mental reaction after they have abortions, haven't they? And you've talked about this in your book, Pro-Voice. Hasn't the pro-life movement attempted to create a link between abortions and mental illness?
Yeah, so if the pro-choice movement doesn't really want to talk about or acknowledge regret, or they want to try to minimize it in some kind of way, then the opposite happens on the pro-life side, that there's an incredible focus on regret, and is really part of the reason that many activists say why abortion should be illegal, because they want to protect women from this awful feeling of regret. And so one way to protect women from going through this is to prevent them from having abortions to begin with. And so in both cases, you know, it's really a lot of other people saying sort of what's a valid emotion or not, or how to get through it. And what we think is interesting is actually listening to people who've experienced regret and how they move through it, how those feelings changed or didn't change over time. And so that's so much about what we're about in the pro-voice movement, is creating that space for people to be able to talk for themselves and to listen to how they have navigated these challenges.
And of course, it can be very bewildering when a woman is even considering whether or not to get an abortion. Often you have these pro-life organizations, Christian organizations that parade as clinics where women might be able to get help making decisions, or even get some kind of reproductive health, and they walk in and find that they're, you know, shown horrific photographs of fetuses and bloodied, you know, abortion, just the abortion horror scene, crime scene type photos, and those certainly don't benefit women either.
I think that's a really good point. It is a treacherous sort of landscape out there for women who are seeking abortions and then women who have abortions. And there's a lot of agendas at every step about, you know, what's the right thing for a woman to do to try to prevent her, you know, from getting an abortion. And, you know, when we're talking to people on our talk line, we're often talking to people who have navigated that in some kind of way. They have walked out of a crisis pregnancy center. They have used a judicial bypass. They have figured out some kind of way to get their abortion. And I think that's an important thing for people to know, is that no matter what the obstacles are, no matter how difficult the images that get put out into the world, that women have always had abortions. They've had them when they have been illegal. They have them when they're legal. That there is always a need and a way to get an abortion. And so that's something that we talk to women on our talk line about, that this is something that lots of people have gone through for centuries.
And Aspen, the other aspect of this conversation is that abortion is not an isolated type issue. It is it goes hand in hand with pregnancy, infertility, miscarriage. The time of life that a woman is in determines greatly whether she, and her economic status. All of these things feed into the issues that are related to abortion, and also related to the desire to get pregnant, the ability to or inability to get pregnant, right? And those things are often just completely separated from abortion to its detriment.
Well, it's been really interesting. I mean, since I have written the book and I've been, you know, traveling around the country talking to lots of different groups, I'm mostly talking about abortion, but I find that when I talk about my own experience with abortion, I talk about the people who call our talk line, the other leaders that we've worked with, people are really responding from so many other personal places, because there's so many secrets and so many things that we're not really supposed to talk about. And I think you just named a whole lot of them: infertility, miscarriage, pregnancy, becoming a parent, not becoming a parent. And all of that we have such unique and personal experiences with. And the important part is that we take a stand of empathy and compassion and create the space to let those stories come out. And the more we fight over them, and the more we sort of fight politically and over public policy, it gets harder and harder for those personal stories to be revealed, because as soon as they're entered into the public debate, they get politicized. And that is so much a part of what it means to be pro-voice.
Now, you mentioned that you talk not just to women, but to men as well.
That's right.
And recently, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, came forward and wrote a very personal blog post about his struggle and his wife's struggles with miscarriages. She's pregnant now, but had several miscarriages. And he very openly talked about it. And it was quite refreshing, actually, to hear from a man about how the fact that his wife has had so many miscarriages has impacted him as somebody who wants to be a parent. How important is that? Is that, I'm assuming, also something you classify as pro-voice?
I would absolutely think of that as pro-voice, and so important and so inspiring for where I said, knowing how many people struggle with getting pregnant, knowing how many people struggle with miscarriage, and the men that we call, or the men that call our talk line and that we talk to, so much about their questions and their conversation is trying to understand, again, similar to women, like, is this normal? You know, is how she experiencing this normal? She's crying too much, shouldn't she be over it? Or she hasn't cried at all, shouldn't she be upset? Just this sense of, like, is anyone else out there going through this? And I think what Mark and his wife just did was saying, you know, we're in this very public position, high profile, and we're letting you in and we're letting you know that we go through this too. And across the board, I think that so many of our political issues are going to be resolved because people are going to continue to speak up and to speak personally and with vulnerability, because that is an incredibly vulnerable thing to do, about what's really going on behind the scenes. And that is the kind of nuance and the kind of real life situations that's going to help everyone make better public policy decisions in the future.
Now, I've noticed that a big part of our inability, I should say, to talk about abortions and all of the things related to it is also sort of how we choose to not tackle it in pop culture, even in liberal Hollywood, which is a very pro-choice place. There are so few depictions of women actually getting abortions and being okay with them. More often than not, you see scenarios playing out in movies and on TV shows where women might have unexpected pregnancies and end up taking the difficult road of having the baby, and that is often celebrated. Is that out of touch with reality?
In a country where 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime, yes, it's not a very good reflection of what's actually happening in people's lives. But it makes sense that pop culture and entertainment would take that path, because historically, over these last few decades, the only way that we talk about abortion is political, and so it feels like it's a political statement to show an abortion rather than show an abortion because this is what's really happening in people's lives.
Of course, it is a political statement.
Change on this. Yeah. MTV did a special in 2010 called No Easy Decision, shows like Parenthood, shows like Friday Night Lights, the movie Obvious Child, of course, that these are all examples of people saying this isn't right. We know that this is happening in people's lives. We want to show this back to them. And that the way that they have approached the topic is with a lot of emotionality, actually, and a lot of emotional honesty and nuance. And when abortion stories are approached in that way in pop culture and entertainment, we find that there's actually very little controversy because people can really relate to it because they have their own emotional experience of abortion as well.
Right. I was just going to say it is a political statement, even if Hollywood doesn't think it's political, to show only or mostly, and you pointed out just a very few exceptions, but the most common expression of or depiction of women's dilemma with abortion is to not get an abortion, and choosing to show that side much more often is a political statement that they might not like to accept as political, and that also feeds into the guilt that women might feel if we do talk about it more openly. Isn't the personal decision of whether or not to get an abortion perhaps an easier decision, or might it not be an easier decision to make whether or not to get an abortion if we do talk about it more often, do see it in our media?
That is an incredibly interesting question, and I I don't actually have the answer for that. I find that, you know, there's a lot of different ways that people make sense of sort of why we have the debate and what can fix it and how it should exist and how do we handle the issues of guilt and shame and regret. And one of the things that I think is important to realize is that women are very capable of acknowledging their own emotions, of building support, and of moving through them. That you know, with or without stigma, you know, emotions will still exist around abortion. And so how do we create the space so that women can speak for themselves and men can speak for themselves? And out of that is where the insights and the wisdom will be revealed about what we need to do next. So much about pro-voice is this combination of listening to people and being able to tell our stories and living in the complications and living in the nuances and the gray areas, because we need to resist making it such a black and white issue. We need to resist sort of drawing that battle line of are you with us or against us, because that's not going to take us to the other place.
Now, the issue of race and abortion and reproductive justice is a very important one that you also tackle in your book. And this is something that a lot of feminists of color have addressed over the years, but it's certainly worth revisiting that the fight for the right to abortion was something that white feminists took on very strongly, but among black women, the right to have a pregnancy and a child is something that has been fought for. And the pro-life movement, I think, has very cynically taken advantage of that history by putting up billboards against abortion, saying, actually even co-opting the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and asserting that abortion is equivalent to black genocide, a genocide of black people just because abortion is available. How has, how do you navigate through that very contentious and important history?
Well, one is to acknowledge it and to listen to it and to create space for it. And I think you just outlined a lot of that history in a really important way. And certainly calling black women who have had abortions as contributing to genocide in some way is not non-judgmental. It's not supportive. It's not respectful. And it's not creating the space for women, black women in particular, to speak for themselves. And so in many ways, it's very simple to say, like, is this creating supportive and respectful atmosphere in recognition of women's well-being, or is it working to try to take that away? And we want to see more and more black women and other women of color, speaking for themselves and having the room and the space to do that, and have other people be able to listen to their needs and to their experiences.
Aspen, let's also talk about the fact that your organization has been around for 15 years, providing this space for women and men to talk about these issues. In those 15 years, have you seen more avenues open up and actually be available for people to speak up a little bit more truthfully? You gave a TED talk about your book, about what you write in your book, Pro-Voice, but I understand this was the first TED Talk ever about abortion, which is kind of amazing. TED Talks cover everything, and yours was the first about abortion.
Yeah, there has been, so TED also has these TEDx events, which are independently organized, and there have been abortion mentioned and abortion stories and abortion topics in the TEDx series, but this was the first sort of main stage, organized by TED event that covered abortion. So I was fortunate to be able to deliver that at the end of May.
And so have you seen more spaces open up that are taking the cue from your organization Exhale and realizing the need for people to be able to speak up and not be judged about how they're feeling about this issue of abortion?
I have seen so much change in 15 years. It's incredible. And there's ongoing political battles, and there's ongoing stigma and shame and issues. But one of the important things about Pro-Voice is being able to notice when positive change is taking place, and being able to link those things and highlight them and show when that's possible. So a few different ways that we have seen change being possible is when Exhale started, we were really the first and only, post-abortion service. And we were started by myself and other women who'd had abortions. Like, we were the patients. We were the patients of abortion clinics. And we said, there's this other thing that we need and we're not getting it, and so we're going to make it for ourselves, and we're going to offer that to other people. Since then, other talk lines have started. There's a talk line called Backline. There's one called Faith Aloud. There's one called Connect and Breathe. We've seen people who've been working in pregnancy and childbirth, doulas, who've really expanded their care to serve women who are going through abortion. So there is a movement of abortion doulas, or the full spectrum doula movement. One of the most interesting things I think I've seen in just the last year or two is that some of the leaders in pro-choice organizations have really taken the step to talk openly about their own abortions, which is not something that was super common in the past. And we've seen elected leaders. We've seen, Congresswoman Jackie Speer, and we've seen Lucy Flores, who is running for office in Nevada, and Wendy Davis running for governor in Texas, that we are seeing political, public women that, in many ways don't have to tell this personal story, opening up and doing that and making it be a part of the stand that they're taking. We've also seen on the pro-life side some incredible movement as well. They used to only sort of talk about, regret as something that you will have forever, but now we see messages that say healing is possible. We see messages from the pro-life side acknowledging that every person's experience with abortion is unique. We see services that help people build networks of support. So we've seen, change in all of those areas as well.
Well, Aspen Baker, give out a website for your organization Exhale as well as your book Pro Voice.
We do. You can visit aspenbaker.com and exhaleprovoice.org. And on my website, aspenbaker.com, there's a listening quiz, there's a Pro Voice pledge, there's guides on how to be a good listener and tell stories, and you can watch my TED Talk.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we will certainly post a link to your TED Talk at our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
Aspen Baker is the founder and executive director of Exhale. She's the author of Pro Voice, How to Keep Listening When the World Wants a Fight. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Kiana Turner is our production coordinator and our visual editor. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.